My name is Nicholas Norbrook. I'm the managing editor of the Africa Report. I was lucky enough to be sitting next to the permanent secretary for the Zambian Ministry of Mines on the flight over. And he gave me this classic example of what we're trying to unpick in this panel, this nexus of water, energy, and the wider economy. He explained how the crisis in the mining sector here was made much worse by lack of power. The bulk of power here in Zambia, as you know, is generated through hydro, and the lack of water in the dams caused by the El Nino weather phenomenon meant less electricity, so less economic activity. And the result is that Zambia's GDP growth fell from 5.6% in 2014 to just over 4% last year. And when your population is growing at 3% a year, 4% growth is near stagnation. So this is critical for the country. Now, as we all know, Al Gore caused climate change. I think I've got that right. Al Gore caused climate change, so he knows a thing or two about it. Here's what he said recently. The accumulated amount of man-made global warming pollution that is up in the atmosphere now traps as much extra heat energy as would be released by 400,000 Hiroshima-class atomic bombs exploding every 24 hours, 365 days a year. And over 90% of that extra heat is being trapped in the oceans, which means it's only going to aggravate things like the flooding that's affecting many parts of the continent, Kenya, Nigeria, Ghana, others, but also the droughts that are causing havoc here in Zambia and the whole of Southern Africa. He's a fun guy, Al Gore, but he's also an optimist. He points to the fact that we're approaching grid parity in solar and wind, which makes the business case for green energy a bankable one. It's going to happen very quickly, which is great, but the effects of climate change will subside very slowly. These droughts are not going away, so Africa will have to adapt, especially as climate change is hitting agriculture hard, which employs 2/3 of people on the continent. So water, energy, agriculture, we have to adapt to safeguard these fundamentals of growth. We have to husband our resources, particularly water. Luckily, we have three eminent panelists who will tell us how. Professor Fred Haron Kiptun Segor is the Principal Secretary for National Water Services in the Ministry of Water and Irrigation in Kenya. Professor Zebediah Piri is the Executive Secretary of the Zambezi River Commission here in Zambia. And Oswald Chanda has kindly stepped in. He's manager of the Water and Sanitation Department here at the bank. So, Professor Segor, perhaps we can start with you by understanding the challenges facing Kenya today, really, in terms of managing its water resources.
Thank you very much. The first challenge which is affecting Kenya as a country, as far as water resources is concerned, is in terms of finance. With the increasing population, there is bound to be increase in demand for water. And therefore, if the finance is not commensurate to the increasing population, it becomes a challenge. So finance aspect is very critical. Number two, the climate change has continuously affected the way we plan for our resources. With the change in climate, you find that you may not be able to correctly predict, for example, how much requirements you need in the water. So the way we are looking at it as a country is what can we do so that we have sufficient storage capacity for our facilities. And lastly, of course, with the changing times, there is need to look at technology. Technology, what is the most efficient technologies to enable us to utilize the scarce resources equitably so that we are able to develop as a country.
Tell us a little bit about storage. What's Kenya done there to improve things?
Thank you very much. In terms of storage, we believe that mega dams are the way to go so that we don't rely in the rain-fed water alone, so that we are able to construct the dams, mega dams, so that we use them for household needs, water supply and sanitation. Number two, we also use the very same dams for food security so that reliably we are able to carry out agriculture. in a more reliable way through irrigation. We also use also the dams in terms of energy generation, because water and energy, they go hand in hand. When it comes to treatment of water, we require energy. And for the functionality of energy as a resource, you also require water. So they are interdependent, so that there is need to be proactive in terms of planning, so that we don't rely on the rains alone for better management.
You mentioned planning. What sort of policy changes are needed really to harness the hydropower potential in Africa?
One, hydropower in Kenya, for example, we still, well over 80% of energy resource in Kenya is hydropower. And this comes as a result of utility of water as a resource. And so we are seeing this is not the only way sustainably we will meet the demands of the populace. So therefore, we have to go beyond the hydropower so that we also look at other sources to complement what we have currently. Yeah.
Thank you very much. Oswald, perhaps staying on hydropower and the sort of the policy framework, what is the bank doing here to help some of the larger projects which, you know, if I had $1 for every time I heard the phrase, Inga will light up Africa, then I'd be a banker like these guys and not a journalist. So what's the bank doing here to nudge these bigger projects towards fruition?
Okay, thank you very much. The bank is doing a lot and on various fronts and in different ways in ensuring that we get the energy, particularly the clean energy, hydropower energy, which we need for development on the continent, because there's a lot of potential that we have on the continent. The Ingas, here in Zambia, the Batokas, and so many other potential sources of hydropower generation points. Now, we begin from the upstream, okay? Because one of the challenges that we've been facing is that sometimes it's difficult to go in a country and find a project that you can easily finance, you know, rather what is often called bankable projects. So the bank is supporting these carrying out of studies, assessments, to a stage where you can now put in investments in developing hydropower generation. The bank is also supporting the capacity development, because yes, it's one thing to have the facilities in place, but you need the human resource that will help in managing sustainably those facilities. Now, the bank is supporting all that. Now, there's one area that is often taken for granted, and being a water person, I want to bring that dimension, that I said the bank approaches this in various and different ways. There is, having had the drought here and the impact that it has had on energy, I think it's become quite very clear that water resources needs to be harnessed. Water resources needs to be better managed so that we can exploit the full potential of hydropower on the continent. And that's where my department comes in now. We're looking at supporting countries in catchment management, protection of catchments, so that the water resources is harnessed for the maximum production of multi-purpose facilities. We're talking of multi-purpose facilities, you know, both for hydropower generation, for irrigation, for tourism, for leisure, and so on and so forth. So there's that aspect that also the African development finances countries to ensure that at the end of it all, you have the clean energy resources. There's one other aspect, maybe not just to focus on hydropower generation. When we talk of thermal power generation, there is a lot of cooling that is needed. We don't have much of nuclear power on the continent, but even when you think of nuclear power, there is a lot of cooling that is needed. And the primary cooling system that is used is water. So you need to harness water for all the different forms of energy generation, maybe except for solar. If you are generating power through solar, yeah, you may not need the water in that case. So the bank is going into all those areas, financing right from the policies, the regulation, the institutional development, the carrying out of the studies, the investments, up to ensuring that there's sustainable operation of those facilities. Thank you.
Can you give us a few examples of successful projects that the bank had taken from idea stage into execution?
Yes. There is one project I was very interested when the PS indicated that Kenya is looking at mega projects. What we like saying is the best fit. Okay? The bank finances both mega, small, and medium projects. There is a project that the bank took right from from the scratch in Kenya. This is the Thwake Multi-Purpose Water Development Program. It's in the Kitui, Makueni area. It's a mega dam that we're developing there up to 81 meters high, and the crest is about 1.6 kilometers. 1.6 kilometers, 1,600 meters. That's a huge dam, and it will be holding about 6 million cubic meters of water. Now, from that facility, they are going to generate 20 megawatts of power. The beauty is downstream of that dam, there is going to be, or there is, irrigation scheme, which was supposed to be a commercial irrigation scheme of over 22,000 hectares. Now, once the water has generated the power, it goes downstream, it's captured for irrigation, and that's commercial irrigation. Upstream of that dam, there is small-scale irrigation facilities, to take care of the people that are living in that community. This is an area where currently, before the project is completed, is a chronically food shortage area. They get food handouts, to survive through the year. But with this dam being developed, the difference it's going to make is fairly huge. So just to give the full flavor of an example of a project where the bank is going in, financing with the Kenyan government, that is going to bring in the water energy, in this case, food nexus.
Thank you. Professor Piri, thank you, a very gracious host. It's fantastic to be here in Zambia. I was talking about the drought and the lack of water in the dams here. Is Zambia rethinking hydro? Is it thinking it should have diversified its energy mix a while back?
Well, I may not speak specifically for Zambia, but the Zambezi Water Course Commission has membership from the 8 countries, and Zambia is one of them. And Zambia and Zimbabwe have been severely affected, of course, by the drought. Of course, there is the issue of the need now to diversify, of course, into solar, into other sources of energy, but also even in the location of the power generation facilities. If you take the case of Zambia, for instance, the major ones are in the southern part of the country. So I should think that there is that rethink going on, particularly in the area of diversifying, in the sense that you can still generate electricity from other sources. Mm-hmm. So this drought, this situation has provided more incentive for going in that direction.
Mm-hmm. Well, one of the questions that the INGA project throws up is this difficulty of multi-country deals. Now, you head up a successful organization that manages the water resources of the Zambezi across national borders. What for you are the critical elements for the better development and management of shared water bodies?
Yes, it did. It's a very complex undertaking, but of course, there has to be something to bring the countries together. If you take the Zambezi Basin, for instance, you're talking about 8 countries. So there are many ways in which that happens. Sometimes it's opportunistic, like the situation that we have now, energy, drought, and so on. and suddenly the countries realize that they have to work together, and then it happens. But there are various levels at which that cooperation should take place. There has to be an enabling environment. At the political level, there has to be the shared aspiration. There has to be the political will for the various countries to come together. In the case of the Zambezi, it has taken in the region of 30 years to get to the point where we now have the Zambezi Watercourse Commission. So yes, there has to be that political realization, the coming together of the countries at the political level, but then they have to move to agreement, to some form of agreement, whether it's a permanent commission or in the case of the ZAMCOM, it's a treaty agreement. But then that's not enough. You need institutions, and that's where we have now things like the Zambezi Watercourse Commission. And it's after that that now you have to deal with the other technical issues now, what procedures, information systems, tools, and so on and so forth. So it takes almost all those elements to get to a point where you have this forum for the cooperating countries to begin to work together in a sustainable way. So those are some of the elements that we have observed. Obviously, it differs from region to region, but these elements that I've mentioned are critical in order to sustain the cooperation and better manage and develop shared water resources.
What kind of pressures do you have on the Commission from various member countries? Are they asking for water for irrigation or for power generation? Or how do you make those decisions about who gets what?
Yes, there is always the issue of national agenda versus a basin-wide or regional agenda. You know, the various countries have their own development plans and political pressures at home to do certain things. But when you are cooperating in this context, you think more about how you share the benefits or how you can have joint projects that need not necessarily benefit just one country. So those pressures are there, but then within the framework of the Commission, we are in the process of developing a basin-wide strategic plan. So that is a process of negotiation where the various countries bring to the table the kind of projects and programs, whether it's power stations, irrigation schemes, and so on, that they have in their plans or that they would like to develop jointly with other countries. But then you have to look at what the basin can take, what the river basin can take, what is the development space that is available. If all those projects were to be realized, would they be sustainable? Would you not have a situation where one country puts up a dam, and because the other country upstream puts up a similar project, then there's no water in the dam and so on, in the sense that the development of one country, development in a narrow sense, undermines the development of another. So we have all those things that we deal with, and one of the things we've done is to develop a basin-wide information system. So this is an information system that's shared and recognized and accepted by all the countries in the basin. And from that, then it's easy for the various countries to begin to see what is possible and what is not possible. What can a country do alone? What can a country do with the other countries? And so on and so forth. So it's a process that's still going on.
Just so we can understand, is there sort of a formula? You know, if you've got X amount of population, then you're allowed to get Y amount of cubic feet of water? Is there some kind of formula like that in terms of sharing out the water?
No, not quite. The various countries, as you know, the contribution in terms of how much a country contributes to the basin is different for the different countries. But then the needs also are different. Even the capacity, the hydropower capacity, for instance, it's easier to develop hydropower, say, in Zimbabwe, Zambia, and Mozambique. But in other countries like Namibia and Botswana, what they need critically is just water for use, for domestic use, for industrial use, and so on and so forth. So rather than focusing on how you share the water, you look at how you share the benefits. How are we going to manage this water? What sort of projects should we work on together so that the whole region benefits? That's the approach that we have taken as opposed to just focusing on the water itself.
Sure. Professor Sego, obviously Ethiopia in the last decade has a very aggressive dam building policy and has completed several, and obviously the big one is yet to come. But I think it comes online this year, and I believe Kenya is importing energy from Ethiopia, or plans to. How has the various demands over the Nile rivers waters been managed in your estimation? What needs to be improved, and how is it going?
Thank you very much. There is what we call Nile Basin initiatives, which brings together the member states which utilize Nile as a river. So the bigger picture of Nile Basin passes through several countries. The Nile also, the catchment areas also encompasses close to 7 countries. So this initiative is bringing together the players, the governments, the people who are interested in managing the Nile, so that they discuss on the best way of managing the basin. Just like what he has mentioned about Zambezi, that is the same approach which is also in the Nile. So that what we are encouraging is inter-country kind of programs, which is able to develop, which is able to assist member states, several member states. And by doing this, we will be able to carry out activity as a basin, so that all the member countries are part of it. Indeed, I'm aware that Ethiopia is developing dams on the same, but while they are doing that, they closely work also with these initiatives, which brings all the governments together, so that we know, for example, how much water they will be requiring, how much water will they be extracting from the River Nile, and for what kind of purposes. What will be the impact of that project in the Nile? Because we are looking at the downstream. The river flows up to Egypt, and the way you know, Egypt requires its water needs entirely, most of it is from River Nile. And therefore, there is need for all the countries to come together so that any project is shared, and agreements to that effect is also made where all the countries are involved. And that is the basis, and that is the purpose why the Nile Basin Initiative was established some years back. And so the countries are in discussion, and most importantly, funders or donors have supported projects which benefit many countries, not only one, across the source up to the downstream of the Nile.
Have there been parts of Kenya which have suffered from Ethiopian damming, perhaps in Turkana?
Not as of now. You are aware that the dam construction has started, yes, but preliminary studies indicate that there wouldn't be substantial impact, negative, on the Kenyan side. But as I had said, maybe this will be realized later on, but as of now, I cannot say exactly what the impact on the Kenyan side will be. But as I had said, it is crucial for all the member countries to look at this from a concerted point of view, so that the resource is limited. What is the best way of us sharing this resource? What is the best way for the member countries to protect the sources of the river? And so at the end of the day, if we look at it positively, if we ensure that we protect the catchment areas, we ensure that we protect the sources of the rivers, then we will be able to project how much water would be extracted from the river with minimal impact, negative for that matter, at the downstream level.
Mm-hmm.
Yes.
Also, yeah, you wanted to jump in.
I just want to make a point on the impact of the dams, because quite often when we talk about the impacts of the dam, we're looking at the negative impacts. If the dam collapsed, what would happen to the people downstream? But I think we forget some of the major positives of constructing dams. And some of these we have investigated through studies that have been undertaken in the past. We, for example, at African Development Bank, when we looked at the dam that we're developing in Kenya, the level of destruction that the water, particularly during flood seasons or periods, the destruction that the natural flow causes to the environment was massive, you know. And with the construction of a dam, you regulate that flow, you know. There is a regular flow, there is a constant flow that is being allowed downstream of the dam. So you immediately regulate, you immediately catch the destruction that would have been otherwise been the case if the dam had not been there. The other element that one needs to look at is in the event of droughts, you know, if the dam or if the facility that has been put up has sufficient storage capacity, then you allow for flow. You allow for flow for the downstream consumers in those drier periods. So there are, I think, more benefits, you know, and of course the issues of dam safety during construction need to be taken into account. The dam that I talked about, you're talking of a 20-story building, that's the dam height, you know. If it collapses, yeah, the sheer momentum of that water would cause much destruction. And this is where now the engineers come in. So I think when we look at the impact of dams, quite often we tend to focus more on the negative side, yes, which can be quite very destructive, but I think there are a lot more positives, and with proper engineering of these facilities, we can get better benefits than focusing on the negatives.
Well, one of the other things that the Ethiopian question for me throws up is, how have they managed to build so many so quickly? Have you learnt anything from their experience? Because they've been, you know, compared to projects in other parts of the continent, we won't even mention Inga, they've managed to put up a lot of dams in a relatively short period. What's their secret, and how can the bank help replicate this elsewhere?
What we see, particularly looking at the Ethiopia case, is the major reason for that big success is leadership. You know, that single purpose to say, we are going to do this as a country. We have suffered. We want to harness nature and use nature for our economic and social benefits. I think that is first. Once you have that leadership, then the planning kicks in. Then the resources can be mobilized. I think we have come to appreciate that. I think many times it's not financing that is a problem, you know. It is the bankable plans, it is the leadership at the local level that is a challenge, you know. With proper leadership, with good leadership, with good planning, you can get these results, you know. In countries where you might find that, I mean, there are conflicts in terms of what should be the priority, what should be done first, and yeah, then you don't see the developments. But where the country is very focused in terms of what they are going to do, what they are going to develop, you get the results as you have in Ethiopia. Thank you.
Thank you. Professor Piri, I was listening to various panels, and the word data kept on cropping up in various different ones. How does the commission, your commission, measure the water flows, and how important is data for you in your practice?
It is very important because that's the basis upon which the countries can negotiate or plan joint projects and so on and so forth. As a commission, what we do is that we do not measure the primary data as such in the country. That's the responsibility of the countries. But our information system is such that you can sit in any country in the basin, but you'll be able to access the same information that the Secretariat is able to access. So we've developed an information system where the countries upload various bits of data and information, whether it's hydrological, meteorological, and so on and so forth. And the countries in that way use more or less the same information for their planning purposes. And also, when it comes to developing joint projects and programs, we use basically the same information. So it's very important if we are going to make informed decisions and plan well that we have this basis, good information, good data. Mm-hmm. So it's that critical.
What's the situation like in Kenya? Do you have a good statistical department? Do you see the value of data, and how are you improving it? Obviously, Kenya's got a very impressive, if nascent, Silicon Savannah program, and you have plenty of apps and mobile money. But what about on the public sector side? Is big data, a very used thing in the public service in your sector?
Yeah, let me begin by mentioning that in Kenya, we have what we refer to as Kenya National Bureau of Statistics, which has been mandated by the government to ensure that they are able to store all data, they are able to update data in the country, and the data for that purpose will be used for planning purposes. So they are the custodians of data in the country. So every ministry is expected to review its programs for the purpose of planning. And when all that is brought together, then the National Bureau of Standards stores the data. You cannot prosper as a country when you don't know where you are coming from and where you are going to. You cannot prosper, you cannot plan for projects when you don't know the ultimate number of people who would benefit from that project. So we believe data management is very important. It is important because it is the envelope which will be used when it comes to putting resources and the target and the output. So data is very important, and as a country we take it seriously, and that is why there's specifically a PS in charge of statistics in Kenya, statistics and data, so that he or she is able to capture all the information and share with the ministries for the purpose of planning for the prosperity of the country. So it is indeed very crucial.
Mm-hmm. And do you have any comments on this idea of Oswald's of bankability of projects in the water sector in Kenya? How do you make sure that the projects that you would like to see come to fruition are well prepared and the finances just have to tick the box?
Yeah, in every ministry, or in our ministry for that matter, we have a planning section. Its work is to ensure that they are able to look at the needs of the ministry. So when you look at the needs of the ministry, then you come up with proposals of what needs to be done. And so a proposal has to be developed. There is a committee which will look at the proposal. They will look at the technical aspects of the proposal. And then when it comes to finances now, this is what my colleague was talking about here, that what are the bankable projects? What are the projects which, when you put money, you are able to realize the results, you are able to realize the output. So it is important that you come up with a proposal, and that proposal will be used to source for funds. And as far as funds is concerned, of course, we work very closely with our finance ministry. And the finance ministry is to ensure that any plans, any requirements for money is within the capacity of the government. If it is not possible, then we look for donor support so that we find ways of looking for donors to support the project.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Fantastic. Oswald, you wanted to come in?
Yeah, I think the question of data, again, this is one area as African Development Bank where we have seen and supported countries in developing information systems And one of the things that is very common is that, yes, the information is collected in many cases using automated systems, and it's there on the computers. Now, many a times there is the automated analysis of this information, but many a times this information is not being made available to the people that need it, to the users, because it's not only the big dam developers. I mean, we also need to look at the farmers in certain cases. This information needs to be analyzed, needs to be interpreted, and this interpretation passed on to the users, But quite often we see that there is a missing link in the loop, Yes, you support the development of the information, the analysis, the storage, but the information is not being interpreted, the information is not being made available to the public. In many countries that we have supported, there is a tendency to want to sell this information, and the public would not be interested in that. So they depend rather on the internet, what they can get on the internet, and that doesn't help much. You need the local information that has been collected, analyzed and interpreted, that would be used in planning and designing of facilities.
Is there a role for the bank then in doing an audit of Africa's water resources, making a website freely available which gives a relatively detailed breakdown of potential mini hydro or just the water resources of the continent?
Work has been done in that sense. I think the potential sites for hydropower generation are very well known. What I know might not be fully done is have the studies been prepared for the development of those sites. But it depends on each country, the priorities that they have. And under the new initiative, the President's drive for Light Up and Power Africa, all these will now need to be looked at, to be developed. Because unless we develop the designs, the financing will not kick in, because the financing can only come in once we have information at hand and analyze and say, well, yes, this is bankable and this is how it's going to be sustained. And we see that in terms of that information, there are several reports at national level, at the country level. In many of the countries, there are a few countries, of course, that we have exceptions, particularly what we call the fragile states, countries that might have been at war for a long time, or countries that have faced various challenges for one reason or the other. The comprehensive information might not be readily available. But we are certain, we have been in some of the countries and see that you may not get the latest information, but you may have information that might be coming from the 70s, the 60s, that one might just need to update, because these are physical features that are there. I mean, if a site is a potential for hydropower generation, you could develop it, and once it's there, unless due to human activities, those sites are destroyed. Thank you.
Thanks very much. Welcome, Mr. Nyambe. Let's broaden the discussion to the impact of climate change. And what for you are the most pronounced climate change impacts on water, and how's that affecting the continent?
Thank you very much, and apologies for coming late. I was thinking it was in the other room. But really coming back to the question here, it's the obvious things that we've heard of. It's, of course, drought, flooding, and above normal heat. But the question is, how is this impacting the key areas of human existence? So we're talking about, for example, how climate change is impacting negatively economic development prospects for countries. Now, there are certain sectors, you're talking about tourism, agriculture, fisheries, wildlife, these sectors are very sensitive to the impacts of climate change. So we should broaden the question, in my view, that we should also be talking about the far-reaching implications of the impacts of climate change. So you find that 25 years ago, for example, the region suffered a major drought. I'm talking about the Zambezi River Basin. And the costs, the drop in export earnings and the drop in GDP was in millions of dollars. Right now, Zambia is experiencing a major drought, a multi-year drought, and the impacts within a period of 18 months, we're talking of inflation changes from a single digit to double digits. We're talking of major power outages and basically affecting the very fabric of economic activities of the country. So the impacts of climate change are far-reaching. Thank you.
Mm-hmm. Is there any tension between, a desire to tackle climate change on the one hand and maybe, environmental conservation on the other?
It's really about the mindsets. Climate change is about water, and water really defines the existence of biodiversity. Water is at the core of river systems. So you're talking about the need to manage your forests, you're talking about the need to manage your wetlands, because if you do not manage them and ensure that you, for example, invest in ecological infrastructure and then de-risking investments, de-risking grey investments, so there is no tension, but it's actually the decisions that we take. It's up to us. The status quo is not an option. The example that I gave on Zambia speaks volumes because we have for a long time relied on hydropower generation, and we are seeing the impacts now. And if you're talking in terms of the whole continent, we're talking about 23% of hydropower generation, which is basically driving the economy. What will happen to major river basins, the Congo, the Nile, the Zambezi River Basin? What will happen? So for me, there is no tension. It's about the decisions that we take now in terms of de-risking our investments, ensuring that we invest more in ecological infrastructure, and also broadening our energy mix to ensure that there is adequate provision for alternative energy sources.
You talk about ecological infrastructure. Can you give us some examples of successful investments in that?
Of course, I think one of the things that you can talk about is what Ethiopia has been trying to do now in terms of greening the economy. That is an example of a move towards that. African countries have in recent times been, if you talk about the INDCs, there was that major development prior to COP21. I think there is that commitment and willingness on the part of African governments, but we now need to implement those commitments that we've made. So the investments are just beginning in most cases. Mozambique has just recently developed the green economy plan, and that is very encouraging. So we really need to now see more investment in this sector.
Just on the COP21, it seems that countries like India and others are very good at accessing clean financing mechanisms. But while they're scooping up the cash, African countries have been less successful in accessing these funds when really they should. And I'll come to you, Oswald, in a moment, but perhaps I could get your perspective on that.
Yes, thank you for that. I think we need to step back a little bit and ask ourselves as to the role of science in public policy, because science actually could inform more of the African agenda, but my view is that we've not really taken that sufficiently, because for you to access those funds at the global level, you need to have watertight fundamentals calculated into your requests for financing. If you fail to do that, then it's not like free cake for everybody. So we need to have a very, very clear, and rather, we need to build robust policy science links. And I think that is just one starting point. But overall, we also need to ensure that we have, for example, proper projections of what the impacts of climate change are going to be. For long, we've been relying a lot on historical data. The future, as somebody said, is not likely to be the way we've known it. That's just the reality.
Thank you. Surely there's a role for the African Bank here to better help its clients on the continent in accessing this money. The Paris conference, there was a big commitment made there. What can the bank do to help African states capture some of that cash?
Well, maybe let me, before I look at what the African Development Bank is doing to promote this, let me just mention what we find on the ground. The African Development Bank is very keen to help countries on the continent access climate and environment funds. In a number of cases, the bank is either a focal or implementing agency for it means it's a conduit for some of these resources on the continent. Now, what we find in many countries is that there's lack of capacity, and I'll break this down. There's lack of capacity. There's lack of capacity in terms of knowledge. There are countries where, at the moment, they are quite still very ignorant about the available climate financing. We're talking about within public sectors, because these are the drivers. Some of the private sector people might have the information, but within the public sector, who are the major drivers of development in the countries, there's no awareness, on the available facilities for supporting climate resilience building. The second element is that there is lack of technical understanding, of what is required, and hence they cannot prepare proposals that would be acceptable. Although this information, one can very easily get it on the internet with a little bit of investigation to develop a very good proposal that could be financed. So the bank has gone in a vigorous campaign to try and ensure that whenever a water project, whenever some of these energy projects, whenever some of the agriculture projects are being rolled out in the countries, these resources are accessed on behalf of the countries, as grants. In many cases, these are coming as grants, and they are being made available to the countries. Besides that, the African Development Bank has undertaken a number of trainings for focal persons from within the countries to bring an awareness to the availability of these resources, but also even to train some of these focal persons on how to go about in preparing a proposal that would fly. But the bank has not ended there. We have provided technical assistance. And some of these funds, for example, the JEF funds, they have provision for giving technical assistance to the countries. Some of the countries are not even aware that they can get that support to develop projects. So I think the biggest challenge is the lack of awareness, the lack of expertise, to develop proposals so that they access these resources. Mm-hmm. I mean, the level of dynamism, the level of activity that we see, for example, when you are in Asia, you're in South Korea, is different. It's totally different. We see a little bit of that in Kenya, for instance. I mean, Kenya, you get a lot of participation. Nigeria, you get a lot of participation from NGOs, from within the public sector, because some of these resources are not only available to the public sector, they are available to NGOs, they are available to the general public, as long as one has put in a proposal that is plausible.
Well, let me, you'll jump in a sec, Nambe, but perhaps we could talk about the Kenyan example. I mean, is the awareness of how to access these funds, widespread through the public sector in Kenya? And tell us a little bit about your renewable sector.
Yes, let me say that as a country, it is the responsibility of all ministries to ensure that they are able to know the possible funders or projects in their respective ministries. And this is shared amongst the ministries and the parastatals in the government. In addition, there are also other actors, which includes non-governmental organizations, which include also the private sector, which would have worked closely with the government. So when there is a funding window, as a government, we are looking at how to share that information right from the government to the lower level. So we have a systematic way of sharing information. And number two, since interested persons are able to access also information from the websites of the respective organization, then it is also possible for anybody who is interested to get information. So
has
indeed,
has
we
Kenya,
share, yes.
Kenya's got money from clean development mechanisms or these things?
Yeah, it is. If you look for the information, you will get the information.
Okay,
yes.
great.
Yes.
Thank you, moderator. Personally, I think that's where I find a bit of a concern. I think what we would need, because of I think what Oswald has elaborated here, is the need for an African natural capital power and water infrastructure preparation facility. I think we have to acknowledge the fact that there are inherent weaknesses in different countries, but then we also need to look at the facts as to why we have these weaknesses. I think the bank could, and other cooperating partners could really assist the African countries to have that facility, to build capacity within different countries, because I think the reality is that the capacity is variable across the countries. And if one looks at maybe the Kenyan example, there could be reasons why that is happening. But do we have a facility that can support the various African countries?
Thank you. I'd like to...
Can I respond to that?
Of course.
Because
yes,
this is something... Yeah. Yes, we do have facilities. We have something that is owned by the ministers of water, AMCAO, those that might know with these jargons of African ministers of water. They have a facility called the Africa Water Facility. The Africa Water Facility has been established for the sole purpose of developing or supporting countries develop bankable projects. Okay? And in 2014, they made a call for proposals. Now, this call for proposals was online, you know? And one of the things that we were very interested in, and it was to governments, it was to NGOs, it was to institutions on the continent that were interested or had proposals related to climate change and water. Now, when the applications came in, we did an analysis. The total applications, how many came from Southern Africa, how many came from North Africa, how many came from Southern Africa. And if you look at the statistics, I don't have the hard numbers now, but it was appalling to see, I mean, the highest number of applications came from Kenya, Nigeria, Uganda followed, and then these other countries. Some countries had 0 application. Now, if we're dealing with that sort of thing, I don't know what one will do. This is a facility that has been established and developed by the ministers of water themselves. Now, if people cannot then respond to that, I don't know what we shall do, because we are working with the ministers, and we send this information out in the open. I mean, the internet is open. I mean, this is where you get all these things, you know. And in certain cases, we even asked that they could put it in the national papers for people to know that there is this call for proposals. And these are grants. They are not loans. These are grants that we're giving out.
I think there is a role for the media and other influencers there.
Yeah.
Sorry, you wanted to say?
Yeah, I think I hear you, Oswald, and I really would have loved to have come in early on this, but this is where the issue of support to these countries to actually prepare quality proposals. The issue here is we should not leave it to the water sector alone. Water is everybody's business. So if we leave it to the ministers of water across the continent. Are we responding effectively and efficiently to this big challenge? I don't think so. I think the water being everybody's business, we need to really push hard that, like maybe the Kenyan experience, that water and energy are more integrated, and also looking at how water especially impacts the socio-economic aspects of people, because we're talking about building bankable projects, but sustainable bankable projects, not just bankable projects. Yeah.
Thank you. So do we have any questions for our panel? Any questions or experiences you'd like to share? Yeah. Do we have a microphone? If we take 3-4 questions, and then we'll bounce them to the panel, and we can go back to the floor afterwards.
Thank you very much. Is it okay?
Yeah.
Well, it's a silent microphone.
No, that's working.
Thank you very much, moderator, and the panel. My name is Robert Chimambo. I'm coming from Pan-African Climate Justice Alliance, but Zambia Climate Change Network. This is a very interesting discussion, especially in the context of climate change. And it's an opportunity for people coming from the grassroots to see and hear people who live in the stratosphere, like Mr. Chanda there, talking about water. Now, quickly to get into, indeed, for Zambia and the region, Professor Piri, how we manage water will determine how we survive climate change in the next 50 or so years. Because for us here, it's either too much water or too little water. And therefore, we need to put in means and ways of how that is done. Now, the issue is, I hear my brother from Kenya talking about building dams. This is exactly what we've been doing here, building dams for the last 100 years. We have Kariba. What has happened to it? It's dry. The smaller ones we have, they're all dry. It is not enough just building dams. The natural infrastructure, I think I heard that word there, the deforestation, that is happening. And a lot of it is driven by industry. We have Northwestern Province where we are giving out licenses for mining. That is where the Zambezi comes from. The place now is turning into a mining area. What mining does, and Zambia, we are the 110 years of mining, is that it brings all the people in that area and they deforest area. That's what happened to the Congo. Kafua is drying up. Mm-hmm. We need to address that. So, Bonachanda, infrastructure should not just be Kariba Dam. Even what Mr. Nyambe is talking about, infrastructure, forestry, we need to reforest the area in order to capture the water, what it's doing. And then that brings me to the issue of catchment protection. Catchment protection should be at sub-chiefdom level. What is driving, for instance, the deforestation is charcoal, is energy. If we don't provide alternative renewable energy to the sub-chiefdoms, at chief level, they continue cutting down the trees. Kariba won't do, the infrastructure will do, it's too dry. Over the last 40 years, I'm 69 years, I can speak as a witness to example. All our rivers are drying up. What has happened in the Kariba, even if people are saying it's that it is because of 2 years or 3 years, no, it's a trend that's been going on for the last 40 years. So let's not delude ourselves that it's because of even if we had a massive rainfall this year, it will take another 4 or 5 years, even 10, to fill up Kariba. So the key, Wanachanda, is that how do we, your resources, you see, when you pass through the Minister of Finance, the small chiefdom in Kaleni Hill, they want to know anything about that money. But those are the people that need the money to conserve the sub-catchment, which ultimately form the big catchment that Professor Piri is doing. So how do you develop funding grant mechanism? If you put it on the internet, of course, I mean, my chief won't hear about it. How do we design means that would get to the sub-chiefdom level, to the women, to the youth, so that we protect those catchments, sub-catchments, which protect the sub-catchments and the larger catchments. That, I think, is a challenge moving forward.
Thank you very much for that.
Yeah, thank you.
I think there's someone in front of you with a question. Just back.
Good afternoon. My name is Amina Tangam, and I'm attending as a spouse. But what I'm interested in is about wells. I did not hear anybody talk about wells. And I know that it's not everywhere in Africa that you have a river that you can build a dam, but most of our people depend on water coming from wells, particularly the women, they use the water from the wells. So I want to find out what is being done about wells. Is anything being done about that, please?
Thank you very much. We have another question here at the front. And then a question over here, and we'll open it to the panel.
Good afternoon. My name is Diane. I'm from South Africa. I was very happy with your response in terms of integrated planning. As they discussed with nutrition security, it's not an issue of health, it's not an issue of agriculture. The issue of water security certainly cannot lie only with water ministers. It has to sit among a number of portfolios. So my comment or my question is that in South Africa we've had a very successful renewable energy program where it has been completely integrated. We've got the Department of Environmental Affairs involved, economic development, treasury, trade and industry, finance, across the board. And I was also very impressed to hear that Kenya has privatized 30% of its energy supply. What we've done in South Africa with every single IPP or PPA that has been awarded, a certain portion of that money has to go back towards socio-economic development and enterprise development. So what renewable energy has done in our country is it's created jobs, it's facilitated skills training, and that money gets plowed back into fostering the green economy at a small business level. I'd like to hear what the prerequisites are for your foreign investors who come into the continent in terms of what they do and how they use that money. Thank you.
Thanks very much. And a question over here.
Thank you very much. My name is John Cavallo. I come from the Horn of Africa region, IGAD Secretariat, where drought is a characteristic that is constant. And I'd like to thank the members of the panel for introducing a topic that is clearly very interesting for all of us. And in the context of climate change and our worsening ecological circumstances, water is clearly a very important issue. I wanted us to propose that we introduce 3 new ways of looking at water. One is that most of us in Africa look at water in form of rain. I think we're going to have, for most of Africa, we're going to have to learn to live without rain and find another way of living. Because clearly, most of us wait for rain, it doesn't come, crops fail and so on. And clearly, we've been messed up because we have been banking on rain. Secondly, we are going to have to look elsewhere for water. For example, in our region, we have a lot of underground water. I didn't hear the panel talking about underground water, but there is a lot of resources under the ground that needs to be exploited. And we also need to do, and the third point is we need to do what Colonel Gaddafi did in Libya. We need to look and get water from where it is, forget boundaries, these country boundaries and so on. And in Libya, they got water from 1,500 kilometers, drove it all the way to where it is needed. We're going to have to think of doing that kind of thing to be able to get water. In other words, collect it from wherever it is and channel it where we need it. So we need to look at water in a different way, far from what we've been doing these past weeks, because clearly our circumstances are changing. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Professor Piri, maybe I could start with you and ask you this question from the floor about how we can design funding mechanisms that protect sort of sub-catchment areas, and also to talk about this tension between mining and deforestation and the source of the Zambezi.
Thank you, moderator. Well, maybe we haven't been very explicit, but when we talk about sustainable water resources management and development in the Zambezi Basin, we are talking about the whole system. So we are talking about surface and groundwater as well. And as Mr. Chimambo mentioned, the issue of protection of catchments. When you protect catchments, there are recharge areas for groundwater, for instance. So the protection of catchments also applies to both surface and groundwater. And then the issue of sub-catchment water resources management, I know that most of the countries, at least in the Zambezi Basin, have been going that way, where you have set up agencies to manage the water at the broad catchment level, sub-catchment level, and water user committees. Perhaps it hasn't, it's fairly new, it hasn't quite, we haven't seen the benefits yet, but that's the direction that most of the countries have decided to go, because you just have to do it. You have to manage right from the sub-catchment or water user level right up to the transboundary level, as we are doing in the Commission. I know that there are a lot of efforts in the countries, but perhaps it's still not enough. We have to do a lot more in that area. The issue of integration of, the issue of deforestation, that it does affect the water supply, the issue of erosion, and so on and so forth. So it's a number of things that have to be dealt with if we are going to manage the water resources sustainably.
Professor Segura, I thought this point was very interesting about how do we make sure that money actually gets down into those smaller municipalities and smaller localities. How are you managing to do that in Kenya?
Let me begin by saying that there is an issue concerning protection of catchment areas. In Kenya, for example, we have what we refer to as Water Resources Users Association. These are the people who live within the catchment area. So as a government, we felt that what can we do so that we encourage them to protect the environment? So we encourage them to form associations, and through those associations, we will be able to support them financially so that they protect those catchment areas. Their support will come in form of grants from the government, and the support can also come from grants from other donors, including, of course, the banking institutions. So we believe that this is one of the ways of ensuring that everybody participates in ensuring that we protect the water sources. Number two, when it comes to how we ensure that funds reach the lowest level of people in the municipalities and etc. One, the water sector in Kenya, from the year 2002, water sector was reformed. It was reformed in the sense that activities were not being managed from the national level. The water utility companies were established up to the lowest level possible. So it is from those water utilities at the lowest level that they are able to come up with proposals on what kind of projects they have, and they ask for support. So already from close to 14 years ago, water already had been devolved, the utility of water had been devolved to the smallest units at the lowest level. Through this, management will be enhanced in terms of, we will not be micromanaging the organization when it comes to the usage of water. So we believe that when you decentralize, it is the best way so that you improve management. Smaller units are better in terms of when it comes to management of resources. Number two, let me also mention something on groundwater. When we talk about groundwater, as a country, we believe that this is one of the sources of water. And in Kenya, we are doing a mapping so that we exploit underground or groundwater. And through this effort, we've worked very well with UNESCO in coming up with what is referred to as a regional, Groundwater Regional Institute of Research and Development based in Nairobi. And the aim of this institute is to ensure that what can we do so that we tap on the potential of groundwater? So the best way is first to map where are the sources of groundwater. So you map first so that in case you want to exploit, you don't exploit a well and you find it is dry. You want to be sure that when you spend resources, you spend positively in the sense that you are likely to get water from those wells or from the wells. And currently, I must say that out of the 47 counties we have in Kenya, already we've done mapping for 10 out of the 47. So we know exactly if you want to get groundwater, which points or which areas are you likely, which areas are we going to recommend so that you get the groundwater? So this is very important so that we don't spend resources in futility. It is very important that when you spend resources, you are sure of the success on the same.
It's a great initiative.
Yeah.
Oswald, maybe you could, among other things, tackle this idea of prerequisites African countries should be placing on FDI to see what else can be brought, not just the capital, but other prerequisites.
Yeah, that is a very relevant point. I think that is being raised. Unfortunately, as I had indicated, many of the countries are not prepared and do not make any major demands on the FDIs coming in the country. If you have a policy that addresses, for example, the case of South Africa, if you have a policy and guidelines that every actor in the water sector should follow, the FDI, when they come into the country, should be no exception. You say, okay, welcome, this is what and how we operate. We have this policy, we have these guidelines that should be followed. And sure enough, many will be more than willing to accept and follow the policy that is in the country. It's a very exciting example, but I know there are certain specifics for South Africa, which might not be the case in other countries. But it's always good to have a policy because policy gives consistency, other than just a demand. When this FDI comes in, you say, okay, we want you to do this. Another one comes, we want you to do this. But once you have a policy and guidelines, you say, here we are. This is what you are to follow. I want to make a quick comment regarding the flow of funds. Mr. Chimambo was saying, yeah, okay, as Professor Pili said, we didn't go into the details of some of these technical jargons, but I think catchment management at the local level, the planning, it's a demand for African Development Bank before we undertake any of these investment financing that environmental and social impact assessment must have been done. And that involves consultation of the communities, ensuring that the communities, the affected people, have an input in those plans, and we do a disclosure, for each project before it's approved. We do a disclosure, unfortunately, again, on the internet. But we demand that in the country, it's publicized in the national papers, so the people get to know. But again, you say my mom can't read newspapers. I don't know what else we're going to do. Maybe we should be insisting that it's announced on radios, But even that, some people will still miss it. So it's a requirement, and we are very alert and alive to that. It's one of the things that we critically look at. The question of groundwater, as much as we have maybe not made direct reference to it, what happens to the surface water, most likely you also get the same situation with groundwater. If you have deforested, the groundwater levels tend to get lower. You have to go a lot deeper to get your water. Once you begin mining activities, it becomes a whole lot more difficult to get groundwater. So I think these are elements that one needs to look at when you are doing catchment management, when you are looking at water resources development. And I think the impact in terms of how the surface water is being affected quite often is quite the same with the groundwater. But these can be managed once there are proper measures in place to manage the catchment with afforestation and with, for example, the Thwake River, that the Thwake Dam that we are working on in Kenya. There's a very big component on catchment management. You know, we are putting up sand dams because there's a lot of sediment transport. You know, we are engaging the local NGOs, you know, in planting trees. You know, we are engaging them in various activities to improve the catchments in that area, because we know that you may put such huge investments and 10, 15 years down the road, the dam is silted. You know, you have lost that investment. So we need to put up this upstream investment to see that it is sustainable. That's why we're talking about green growth. Green growth is nothing but talking sustainability. You know, can this thing be sustained that you are putting in place? Thanks.
Thanks very much. We've slightly gone over our time, but Mr. Nyambe, maybe you could wrap things up for us.
Oh, thank you very much. Well, I heard the mention of water transfers across basins, probably.
Oh, yeah.
I think we need to be very careful with that. I appreciate the fact that the challenge is real. We need to, the status quo is not an option, but there are risks, ecological risks that could come with that, such as that risk of invasive alien species. You know, that you create additional problems. I think one thing that I would really want to emphasize is that as we are dealing with the issues of climate change, there is always the risk of maladaptation. So we need to be very aware that we do not worsen the situation by the decisions that we make. Otherwise, we become hostages of our planning trajectories. Now, the other issue that is really of concern is the role of private sector, investment and business in how we manage our water resources. I think if it is made very clear, and I totally agree with the idea of policy, but I think it's not enough. There has to be a sense of shared appreciation of the risks and opportunities. The private sector will invest if they know that they're going to be there for the long haul. If we look at the World Economic Forum reports over the last few years, water scarcity has been ranking amongst the top global risks to business. So that tells us something. It's in fact ranking higher than terrorism, for example. So we are dealing with something that has the potential to actually change the way that we do business on the African continent if we can work with the private sector. And coming to the theme of this annual meeting, really, one is made to believe that the intention of the high fives is really to accelerate socio-economic development and transformation on the continent. Yes, that is very good. But when we divorce the water vision from the energy vision, I think we'll not go very far. The two need to be looked as two sides of one coin. And it's very important that we invest in the ecological infrastructure, and I emphasize ecological infrastructure, particularly wetlands and forests, so that we avoid the risks of freshwater ecosystem fragmentation. And this is very important because we, maybe it was mentioned earlier before I moved in, but we are talking about a finite resource of the freshwater resources. Really, we're talking about 3%, approximately 3% of the water on the planet Earth. So we're talking of a very finite resource, and we need to be extremely cautious and maybe step back and ask ourselves whether the Africa's development trajectory really meets its ecological future. Thank you.